Hello and welcome. Today I'll be talking about similarities and divergences in the treatment of the Irish Georgian heritage between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So it's a comparative analysis of how this heritage has been treated through the 20th century all the way to present day. And this was a research that I had originally undertaken a few years ago based on a sort of key hypothesis itself coming from a quote that I had read, a 1963 Irish quote that said, what is Irish is good, what is foreign is bad, and therefore Fitzwilliam Street must go. This is a quote that's very representative of the Irish mentality at the time of the 1950s and 1960s, which was a very anti-British sort of mentality, and it's representative of heritage attitude of the period as well. So what I wanted to do is explore whether that was the determining factor in what had happened to the Georgian heritage by comparing it with Northern Ireland, or whether there were other elements that were also relevant, or maybe more relevant than just that. So the aim of the research was to determine whether dissonant heritage, dissonant feelings for heritage, was the determining factor in post-colonial context in the treatment of a heritage that is able to be labeled as colonial, essentially, or whether there were other elements, as I said. So for that, the objectives were, first of all, assessing the treatment of the Irish heritage and drawing a comparative timeline between Northern Ireland and the Republic to identify trends and biases, as well as looking at political and religious issues rooted in that Protestant-Catholic divide between the two, particularly in Northern Ireland, and looking at the current listing situation between the two countries, as well as a particular element, which is country houses and the treatment of these between the two countries. So the methodology was, first of all, basing the Georgian period in the historical conventional one, so 1714-1830, looking at the destruction rate of country houses and drawing the comparative timeline of the evolution of conservation legislation and efforts between the two countries, and then looking at listing patterns. So as we look at present listing as of 2022, we can see that these curves don't really tell us much. We can see that a majority of Georgian and Victorian buildings are listed. For Northern Ireland, there is some lack of data, particularly for, it was quite significant, but it doesn't tell us whether there are any biases. If anything, this current listing situation shows that there are none, essentially. But as we look at the destruction rate of country houses, we can see very clearly that there is a big difference. So in Northern Ireland, about a third of the country houses were lost. They were lost quite late, actually, after the partition, so starting in the 1970s with the Troubles. Whereas in Southern Ireland, which is at least 3 times bigger, we can see that 3/4, so 76% of the country houses were lost, and many of which were actually before the period of the Troubles. So this trend confirms the hypothesis that we had, that actually it was psychological stances that determined the fate of the Irish heritage. And these country houses were targeted specifically because they were a symbol of British or Anglo-Irish power on the island of Ireland. Now, looking at the history of conservation in Ireland, we can see that there were early conservation efforts and legislation passed. So we have the Irish Church Act in 1869 with the officious objective of weakening the Catholic Church in Ireland, but also the official and more heritage-oriented objective, which was to protect churches, particularly those that weren't used as monuments. This was consolidated by the 1882 Ancient Monuments Protection Act, passed both in Great Britain and Ireland. So for a time, actually, Ireland was ahead in terms of legislation compared to Great Britain in terms of conservation legislation. And then at the turn of the century, into the 20th century, probably because Westminster had sort of felt that it was going to break away from Ireland, there was key legislation that was passed on the island of Great Britain but not in Ireland. So the main one being the creation of royal commissions for the protection of ancient and historic monuments in 1908. Each constituent country having one, so there was one for Wales, one for England, one for Scotland, but none for Ireland. This was also confirmed in the 1913 legislation passed, the Ancient Monuments Consolidation Act, passed as well in all of Great Britain, but excluding Ireland. And with the partition, what happened is that both Northern Ireland, so the part that remained in the UK, and Southern Ireland, so the part that broke away and became independent, inherited of the same situation in terms of heritage legislation. And this meant a weak legislation, essentially. There were also problems of funds for different reasons, but creating a similar economic situation. We had understaffing, a lack of institutions, and clear responsibilities attributed to them. And so this created a sort of non-inclusive legislation in both parts of Ireland that led to a form of paralysis in terms of protection. The only difference that can really be identified is that in Northern Ireland some monuments are listed, but no actual protection is there in order to prevent harm being done to them. This changed in Southern Ireland, which in the 1960s, 50s and 60s experienced an economic boom, which led to the possibility for redevelopments. And this meant that buildings started to be torn down. This had as a positive consequence the creation of societies, such as the Irish Georgian Society, for example, in the 1950s and 60s. We also have mobilization from students. It's not just learned societies, but also members of the Irish civil society who protest against these demolitions. And so the voluntary sector starts mobilizing itself, but as can be seen, most of the fights led against demolitions will be lost. That still means that some historic buildings were saved through popular mobilization. So very early on, the voluntary sector starts to play a key heritage role in raising awareness and salvaging some of the historic heritage of Ireland. The role of the state during all of this period will actually be negative in terms of heritage conservation. So this is a picture of Fitzwilliam Street before and after the 1960s redevelopment. And as can be seen, a good part of the Georgian townhouses were raised and redeveloped. This was duly supported. So the first reason was that Ireland wanted to modernize itself, which was in accordance with the 1950s and 60s sort of general mentality. But at the same time, it was a way to get rid of the British look, if you like, the way Fitzwilliam Street looked as a very English Georgian street, and it was a way to break away from that in Southern Ireland, in the mentality of Irish planners of the time. And this continued until what I call the wind of change happened, and this was possible in both Northern and Southern Ireland by supranational intervention. In the case of Southern Ireland, it was the prospect of joining the European Union. That meant that Southern Ireland had to up, in a sense, its standards in terms of legislation, including conservation practice. So in order to join the EU, Ireland had to catch up in terms of conservation legislation, amongst other things. As for Northern Ireland, it was with the start of the Troubles in the 1970s that Westminster took direct control and dissolved Stormont, and by doing so, it was able to pass legislation directly onto Northern Ireland. And this meant that the first conservation legislation was passed in Northern Ireland was passed by Westminster, essentially, in 1972. So that's decades after the partition, where pretty much no legislation was passed. And this is when we start seeing a better conservation practice and an actually inclusive legislative apparatus against heritage demolitions and alterations. It's also, with the start of the Troubles, an era of new involvement of the public sector, so to speak. So, particularly Northern Ireland, and particularly Belfast, started to become the theatre of space appropriation. So both Catholic and Protestant communities would express their belonging to the place where they lived through mural paintings, for example, as can be seen in here. And it's a sort of advertising campaign. It's a sort of museum creation, museums without walls, essentially, in Belfast. And it's a way to populate the space, the visual space. So this is a new conservation philosophy, a new heritage building philosophy that takes place in Northern Ireland. Just to wrap it up, concepts of dissonant heritage, and inspired from Ashworth and Tunbridge book on dissonant heritage, I came up with this list of indicators that were aimed at comparing essentially the situation between both Northern and Southern Ireland in terms of the nature of the boundaries to heritage protection, for example, or were the alterations done to that heritage optional or compulsory? What about state responsiveness? What about the public sector involvement? And we can see that most elements are actually similar. There hasn't been a big difference between Northern and Southern Ireland, and it's not surprising that it led to the same results. The main difference being the psychological stance between Northern and Southern Ireland. So, as a conclusion, what actually determined the fate of the Irish-Georgian heritage between Northern and Southern Ireland wasn't the psychological motivations, so dissonance in Southern Ireland, consonance in Northern Ireland, but it was, first of all, the weak legislation. So legislation is key in either protecting or leaving heritage or leaving it unprotected. And economic situations are actually a determining factor in what can happen to heritage. So for example, in the South, although there was no legislation to protect heritage, because the country was poor, it was unable to redevelop, and so heritage was safe. In Northern Ireland, as opposed to that, in Northern Ireland, although there was a will to conserve buildings, although there was a listing process taking place, the lack of strong legislation and the lack of funds meant that no protection was essentially done to those buildings, except from sort of symbolic, so to speak, listing. So the main determining factors have been actually legislation and then economic changes, economic situations. And this is what led to this is what has been the most determining factor in the preservation or not of the Georgian Irish heritage. And just to end it, this sort of conflict and appropriation of space, conflict between Protestant and Catholic communities is still of actuality, and it has been internationalized often, as can be seen on this picture of the Falls Road, where struggle or conflict between the two communities has been advertised worldwide in an effort to internationalization of the situation. Thank you.